I stood before the towering iron gates of Blackwood Estate, clutching the heavy brass key that promised a new life, but felt like a cold omen in my palm. The lawyer's letter had been clear about the inheritance. Yet, as I stepped into the foyer, the oppressive smell of grease and ancient dust made my skin crawl. With an instinctive warning, I moved deeper into the house, noticing that the walls weren't just stone and wood, but seemed to house hidden, rhythmic vibrations that pulsed like a mechanical heart. My curiosity led me to the central study, a room filled with strange blueprints and brass instruments that hinted at my grandfather's obsession with complex machinery. The moment I touched the mahogany desk, a sharp click echoed through the silent hall, and the massive door behind me slid shut with a force that rattled the floorboards. I lunged for the handle, but it had vanished into the frame, leaving me staring at a seamless surface of cold, reinforced steel. Suddenly, the floor beneath the desk began to tilt, and I heard the low, guttural groan of massive gears, awakening deep within the foundations of the mansion. A section of the rug slid away to reveal a dark, yawning pit where rows of jagged metal teeth began to rotate with a terrifying, rhythmic precision. I scrambled toward the bookshelves for safety, but they began to retract into the walls, narrowing the floor space until I was balanced on a thin strip of wood. The air grew hot and thick, with the scent of burning oil as hidden vents opened, releasing a hiss of pressurized steam that clouded my vision. I could hear the structural beams of the room shifting, as if the entire house were a giant clock being rewound by an unseen hand. I grabbed a heavy iron candle holder to wedge into the nearest gear, but the machine snapped the metal like it was a mere twig. Every movement I made seemed to trigger a new mechanism, with hidden panels in the ceiling, dropping heavy lead weights that narrowly missed my head. The walls themselves began to move inward, inch by inch, creating a crushing pressure that made the air feel thin and impossible to breathe. I realized then that the inheritance wasn't the house itself, but the challenge of surviving its lethal architecture. My fingers bled as I clawed at the stone, searching for a manual override or any flaw in this mechanical nightmare. The grinding sound became a deafening roar, drowning out my own frantic thoughts. As the pit in the center grew wider and more hungry, I saw a small brass lever hidden behind a portrait. But reaching it required me to leap over the spinning blades that were now mere inches from my feet. The heat was blistering now, and the rhythmic clanging of metal on metal sounded like a funeral bell, marking my final minutes. I took a desperate breath, focused all my strength into my legs, and prepared to make the jump that would decide my fate. That's when I thought it was over. I had no idea what was about to happen next. The story isn't over. Subscribe the channel to continue. The jump took every ounce of my courage, and as my fingers brushed the cold brass lever, the floor beneath my previous position collapsed entirely, into the dark abyss. I pulled the lever with a desperate prayer, hearing a series of chaotic clangs as the primary gears began to grind against each other in a shower of sparks. The room's inward movement slowed for a fleeting second, but then a secondary system kicked in, and the ceiling began its slow, inevitable descent. I saw a narrow ventilation duct near the floor that had been exposed by the shifting walls. Its dark opening, my only chance to escape the crushing weight above. I threw myself onto the cold floor and crawled into the cramped metal tunnel just as the ceiling met the floor with a bone-shaking thud that vibrated through my entire body. The duct was narrow and filled with sharp metal edges that tore at my clothes and skin. As I pushed myself forward through the suffocating darkness, I could hear the machinery resetting behind me, the house preparing itself for the next stage of its lethal game. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me to navigate the labyrinth of pipes and wires by touch alone, my heart hammering against my ribs. I reached a vertical shaft where a massive chain was moving upward, and I had to time my movements perfectly to avoid being caught in the heavy links. The smell of rust and old grease was overwhelming, making me gag as I climbed higher, away from the grinding death below. I found a small maintenance hatch that led into the crawl space between the walls, where I could see the vast, intricate network of pulleys and counterweights that powered the trap. The complexity of the design was staggering, a masterpiece of engineering dedicated solely to the destruction of anyone who entered the study. I navigated the narrow beams, my balance wavering as the house groaned under the weight of its own internal movements. A sudden jolt threw me sideways, and I barely caught a support pipe as a heavy stone block swung past, nearly crushing my ribs. I followed the sound of the wind, realizing that a window must be open somewhere in the attic space above the mechanical core. My hands were raw and shaking, but the sight of a faint sliver of moonlight through the rafters gave me a final surge of adrenaline. I squeezed through a gap in the wooden slats, feeling the cool night air hit my face like a blessing after the stifling heat of the traps. I didn't look back as I scrambled down the roof and dropped onto the soft, damp earth of the garden, my body trembling with the shock of survival. The house stood silent and imposing behind me, its windows dark, hiding the lethal clockwork that still ticked within its walls. I realized the true tragedy was that my family had spent generations perfecting a tomb rather than a home. I walked toward the gates, leaving the keys in the dirt, knowing that some inheritances are better left unclaimed and forgotten. The sun began to rise, casting a long shadow of the manor across the lawn, a final reminder of the darkness I had barely escaped. I knew the physical wounds would heal, but the sound of those grinding gears would echo in my mind every time a door closed too loudly. I was free, but the house remained, waiting for the next person to come seeking its hollow promises of wealth. One last question. If you were in her place at that moment, would you have done the same? Be honest. What does her choice deserve out of 10? Subscribe now. The best story is coming next.